We're going to hold off just a few minutes as you all join, but I do want you all to use the Q&A button when you have questions. Make sure that you set your chat to everyone. And remember that by joining this live stream and by interacting on the chat, that you are abiding by our code of conduct. So in sum, be kind to one another, and please, refrain from oversharing some of those LinkedIn links. So please do not share any links in the chat. Just communicate and share with one another. So as you all are joining, let us know where you're coming in from. I'm going to open up my chat right now. I myself am coming in from Rochester, New York, the Great Lake region of the US. So we have a lot of folks here. I love seeing this chat go on. We got Australia, we got Zurich, we got Toronto, we got New York, Israel, Denmark, Spain, Ghana. Man, we have so many of you joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you. My name is Miggy. I'm going to be your host today as we go through the Figma for Education Learning Auto Layout. Today's session is going to be a primer on auto layout, mostly for beginners, but there's going to be some tips and tricks in there that everyone can benefit from. So in just a few minutes, we're going to get started. So great to see y'all. It's okay. It happens sometimes, but let us know where you're joining in from. Once again, make sure you set your chat to everybody. If you have questions during the session today, we will be answering questions after the presentation. Make sure you use that Q&A button. Make sure that when you're chatting, you set it to everyone so everyone can see what it is that you're saying. And once again, just be kind and, don't share a lot of extraneous links in the chat, and we'll be good. So as you all are hopping in, Alex on my team is going to be sharing out a link. So we're going to be working with this file. So the file that I am working on today, where we're going to be talking about auto layout, and we're going to be going through all things auto layout, this whole deck that we have here is already located on the Figma.com education community page. So if you go to figma.com/@education, you're going to be able to duplicate this Figma for EDU learning auto layout file. So this is the file that we're going to be working from today. You can go here, you can get a copy. I can actually see y'all duplicating this live. There's about 64, 65, 66 of y'all duplicating that right now. So this is the file that we're going to be working with today. This is a community file. And it draws largely upon the auto layout playground file that already exists in community. This was a file that I had the opportunity to work on, so it's a little close to my heart there. So thank you all from joining. We got people from Argentina. What else do we have? We got Brooklyn, we got Indiana, we got Brazil, we got Portugal in the house, we got South Africa in the house. Thank you all for taking the time to join us as we are learning together. So once again, my name is Miggy. This is Figma for EDU Learning Auto Layout, February 2023. Okay, so I believe it is about time we can get started. Let me introduce. So myself, my name is Miggy. I'm a designer advocate for education here at Figma. I'm joined by Alex and Lauren, both on the education team here at Figma. I can be reached at miggy@figma.com. My Twitter handle is @Miggy. On Instagram, I'm InstaMiggy. On TikTok, Professor Figma. So here, let me just take a little actual photo booth photo so you know that I am not AI generated. There we go. So this is using the photo booth widget in Figma, and just a little fun to do that there. So a quick reminder that Figma and FigJam are free for students and educators. You get the full suite of professional plan features free as long as you are a student or an educator. So there's a few steps in that process. You're going to sign up for Figma. You're going to verify your education status. You can verify your education status at figma.com/education. There you can get verified. You'll be asked some basic questions like what school are you attending or teaching at? and how you will primarily be using Figma. Once you do so, you can create an education team. You can check out our help docs on how to create an education team, but once you're verified, you have to create an education team. Your starter teams won't automatically be carried over. And then you can head on over to figma.com/community to use community templates to either learn new things about Figma, get templates to learn from, and or widgets and plugins to enhance your working experience. So once again, those 3 steps: sign up, get verified, and set up your team. So I'm going to cover some very basics here in Figma today. So the first thing I'm going to show you up here, this is the Figma interface that I'm presenting from. So I can hide that UI. I can show it there. I am in Figma right now. This top area right here is the Figma toolbar. You can click on that Figma logo to dig into many more of those features that you have available. This first one that I'm going to show you, the quick actions menu, is a very impactful feature in that it will give you the opportunity to search for other things in Figma and help you learn shortcuts as you begin your experience in Figma. So here, what I'm going to do is trigger that quick actions menu and use it to pull up the keyboard shortcuts panel. So I'm going to hit Command P, Control P if you're on Windows, and it's also Command / or Control /. The Control P is for those of you that have a different keyboard layout and might not be able to access that /. So I'm just going to go ahead and do that now. Let's hit Command P, and you'll see this menu pop up. This menu allows you to type in commands that you want to access in Figma, especially if you can't remember the tons of keyboard shortcuts available. So what I'm going to do is type in here keyboard shortcuts. As soon as I type in the letters KEY, I'm going to see that keyboard shortcuts pane. And when I press enter, I can now look through all of these keyboard shortcuts available to me. This was one of the ways that I was able to learn Figma when I was first teaching at the Rochester Institute of Technology and getting started up with Figma. I wanted to see what tools I had available to me and how I can navigate that space. And it really helped me understand what kind of features that were in Figma. One other thing for those of you joining us internationally, if you go to layout, you can come over here and actually swap the keyboard layout for your keyboard shortcuts. So let's say if you have a Spanish style keyboard, then the keyboard shortcuts will be remapped to associate best with your keyboard. So I'm glad for those of you that are joining us that may look at the keyboard shortcuts panel, say, hey, this isn't for me. If you go to layout, you can make it better represent for yourself. So I'm just going to go ahead and set that back to, let's see, where's English? I already lost track of my own. There we go. US QWERTY. That's me. Okay, so I'm going to close that out. And so once again, the keyboard shortcuts pane is going to give you a lot of options. A few other things here in that first page, there are some follow-up resources. If you haven't used auto layout before, ever tried it out, there are some YouTube videos that you can use in supplemental to this live stream that can also help you get started on auto layout. All right, cool. So if you're just joining us, make sure you check the chat. Alex is linking a link to the file that we are currently in. You can duplicate this file and follow along on your own, and or you could just watch the presentation for what it is. Feel free to ask questions in the Q&A panel, and make sure you're setting your chat to everyone. So we're going to begin now. Auto layout is basically frames in Figma that give you the ability to auto organize your content. It's really great for lists, cards, like if you're designing a website or a mobile experience, presentations, and making tables. What auto layout is basically just a frame that helps you organize things. Now, I would love for you to begin to understand why auto layout is helpful by explaining the problem first. So here I have a card that you might see in something like Instagram. So the way that this is designed, there might be a card above it, below it, and you're going to have some text there. As you're designing this, if I was to copy and paste and add more text, this text kind of moves out of that frame, right? If I didn't clip my frame, and nothing else moves with it. If I decided that I wanted to, let's say, expand the size of this image, everything overlaps. So as a designer, I would need to go in here and manually move everything down, right? And that can get painful over time. Every time you want to make a little tweak and you're trying to make these adjustments, right? Without auto layout, it's very difficult to do. So basically what we're trying to do here is think of ways so you can be more effective in a workflow. So what auto layout does is, in that case, it's going to give you the ability to structure that content in a way that can expand and move the way that you would expect it to, that is very similar to how it may be developed for the web. So here, if I show you that same card, but with auto layout applied, this card is now going to be responsive. I can resize that card and the content is going to move with it. So that's going to save me a lot of time as I'm designing things out. And there's two ways that auto layout is going to do this. And we're going to discuss these two ways, but I like thinking of it as these two main ways. Either the content is going to respond, the container is going to respond to the content size. So here, as I add more content, right, the container itself gets bigger, right? So the container responds to the content size, or the content can respond to the container size. So if the container gets smaller or moves left and right, the content kind of adjusts to it. So in this case, as I add more content, it gets larger. And here, as I increase the size of the container, everything else is attempting to fill that space. So with that in mind, and thinking about how this might be helpful, let's start off with the very basics. So here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use these shortcuts here to walk you through the creation of a very simple auto layout frame. So up here, this is just a representation of what your frames may look like in the layers panel on the left. So if I look over here on the left, when I select this button, you'll see that there's this little icon here. This is the auto layout icon, and it's representing that everything inside of this auto layout frame is being auto aligned or is being adjusted, and it's using the size and the scope of its contents to scale it. This frame here is just a generic frame that isn't doing that. So this frame is just basically resizing itself and only using what is known as constraints, but we're not really going to get into constraints just yet. So what we want to do is we want to create a button that grows with size. So if I was to change this button, hello, I am a button. What's taking place here is that this auto layout frame is hugging its contents. So here's a button and here is a text box inside of that. And as this text box gets bigger, the surrounding frame grows to respond to those contents. Okay, so here, if I was to type that same thing, this text grows and that frame that's outside of it does nothing. So what we're going to do is we're going to make these two become an auto layout frame. So what I can do, let's call this, let's say, button right here. I'm just going to type that text in here. I'm going to select this frame and that text, and I'm going to press Shift A. And by pressing Shift A, right, it's going to convert or create an auto layout frame. So now you'll see here that I have a button and it has auto layout properties. So if I hit undo, I click on this frame, you'll notice over here on the right, it says auto layout, and there's a little plus. When I click on that plus, it's then going to create this auto layout panel, and this auto layout panel is going to have a bunch of options. So I can pad this and I can shape it. And what's cool about this is that as I add that text, I can expand this. So, hello, I am a button. And I saw somebody there in the comments said that they didn't know how to remove auto layout with a shortcut. So let's say, yeah, if I change my mind and I don't want this to be an auto layout frame, I can remove auto layout using Option Shift A with that frame selected, right? So I can press Option Shift A and now it removes auto layout. So once again, when you look at your layers panel, this will be the difference between a regular frame and an auto layout frame. Okay. And so here quickly, I'm going to make a simple letter avatar from scratch so y'all can see how this works. So I'm going to do three things. I'm going to draw a rectangle and I'm going to press the T key and draw on a letter A. So here we go. I have a text object and I have a rectangle. Here now, I'm going to draw a circle. And over here, I'm going to draw a rectangle, but I'm going to round out those corners so it makes it a circle. So one thing about auto layout in Figma is that even if you just draw a rectangle and try to create auto layout from those two objects, if I press Shift A, Figma will try to do its best to understand what you're trying to do, and it will make this an auto layout object. That letter A is going to be censored, and we're going to have here some padding values to adjust it. So if I have that same letter A and I drag it over here into this circle, let's move it on top of that circle. And if I try to Shift A, you'll see that what it's instead trying to do is try to make it two objects in succession, right? So it's not exactly what we want to do. Figma's not going to recognize that circle as a frame. So here, this is our rectangle that we rounded off the corners. When I press Shift A, it will now treat that as an auto layout. So as I begin to type and expand that frame, once again, some of the properties that you can change are going to be over here located in that auto layout panel. And I'm going to show you throughout this presentation how best to work with that auto layout panel. But here we're going to start focusing on the padding as well as the spacing and what that means. So if you have more than one element, so right now, this here, these are all auto layout buttons. So this is button 1, let's call this button 2, and let's call this button 3. So if I take these three objects, each one of them is an auto layout frame. But let's say I now want to nest them together, right? I want to create a navigation. Let's say I want to create site navigation. So I can select all three of those and press Shift A, and that will put them into an auto layout frame. I will show you that one more time. So I have object 1, I have object 2, I have object 3. Let's select them all and press Shift A. Now you'll notice, based off of what Figma thinks it's trying to do, it will either make them all in one horizontal line, right? Let me undo. And if it thinks I'm trying to make them vertical, when I press Shift A, it will align them all vertically. Okay. So what Figma is trying to do is do its best to understand what you're trying to accomplish. So let's make this one horizontal. Let's select them all, press Shift A, and I'm going to select all these three over here and press Shift A. Now, when I look over here at the right at my auto layout panel, I can change the direction. So I can set this to a vertical direction of buttons, or I can set this to a horizontal direction of buttons. Likewise, I can do the same here. I can make that horizontal or I can make that vertical. Another thing that I can begin to modify with my frame here, and it's really good if you come over here and name these things. I haven't named this. So let's just call this, let's say button navigation, and let's name this one to, item navigation. So you'll notice that these are arranged, and you'll notice that these icons over here look a little bit different. And that's because the auto layout icon will represent the way that your layout is set up. So you'll notice that these are all aligned, going horizontally, aligned to the bottom, and these are all aligned centered vertically, going vertically. Okay, so it's important to note those differences right there. Okay, so I got that little screenshot. Okay, so a few other things here. When you have these objects and they're arranged in this way, I can select one of those buttons, right? I can double click. So I click and I click again and I select an object in there. And now I can rearrange how they're in there. So I can move button one all the way to the right. I can move it to the left. And I'm doing so with my keyboard shortcuts, just my left arrow and my right arrow. So I can select button two and I can move that left and right. So if I'm working with a lot of content, let's say here, I want to make a mobile layout and I have these three cards, I can select them. I can press Shift A. I can adjust the spacing between them. Now, this spacing value, when I hover over, you can actually see and adjust it right on the canvas. If I hold down the Shift key, it will actually go by a larger nudge value. So right here, it's going by values of 8 because I have my nudge value set to 8. So what's cool about this is, once again, if I need to reorder this, I can select that middle item and I can move it up or I can move it down, right? I can select this item, I can move it up and I can move it down. And once again, one of the true values of this is that if I need to make adjustments to my content here, like if I was to just copy and paste this text, right? I can make adjustments and I can scale this, right? And I can make those adjustments really easily. And you'll notice that everything else will follow in suit because it's all fitting within that alignment, right? So it's basically saying I'm aligning these three items vertically and I'm spacing in between them. So whatever the height is of that middle object, it's going to push out the objects on either side of it. Okay. So once again, just a recap: spacing between items. If I have 1, 2, let me make these a little bit darker so it's easier for you to see. Let's make them blue. So if I have 1, 2, 3 items, I select them, I press Shift A and I hover over, I can change that spacing right there on the canvas. So that spacing value right there. I can also click on it and I could type the value right there on the canvas, the spacing between my items. So I could set that as a nice even value. Okay, so even here, we can adjust those spacing values to be negative. So I can have a bunch of objects in an auto layout frame and say, hey, I would actually prefer that they stack on top of each other. So here I can adjust that value. Now you might notice that these are scaling here from the center. What that is because this frame is inside of this frame here, it's using its constraints. So you'll see these little blue dotted lines, right? And it's basically saying from the center, if I have that instead from the left and the bottom, now when I adjust those values, they're going to adjust to the left. If I select that object again and I change those constraints, let me just highlight that screenshot in the middle so you know what it is that I'm talking about. If I highlight those constraints instead to be from the right and the bottom, now you'll see when I adjust my spacing, it's adjusting from the right. So those constraints can only be kind of given to that object as long as it's in a frame. So right now it's in this frame, so I'm able to adjust those values. And in this case, I wanted it, centered out perfectly, right? So I want this centered. So now they're dragging from that center point. Okay, cool. So I see a question. Can I still adjust spacing independently or will they always be together? So right now, spacing is all of the objects in the auto layout frame. If you want to have two objects space together, right, I can come in here and I can select both of these objects in my frame and I can have them be in their own auto layout. So I can press Shift A and then this way they will have their own spacing. And they'll have their own spacing right there, right? So then these are kind of spaced, but then as a whole, right, these objects are spaced. So if you want, you can put objects together to have their own independent spacing. But what you will have independent control over is going to be padding, right? So with padding, what you're going to be able to do is actually control the outside of the frame, and you can do so independently. So spacing is going to be unified between all of the objects in an auto layout frame, but padding is going to be on that outset. So here, let's pad some objects. So right here, I have an auto layout frame. And you'll notice these padding values are right here. You have your horizontal padding and you have your vertical padding. So here, if I select, I'm adjusting the padding on the outside that is horizontal, and I have my vertical padding that goes right here. All of these layouts are currently, if you go to figma.com/app education, you can download it. Alex is also sharing the file. So yes, you have access right now. You can go ahead, you could grab this file. So here with this selected, you can see I can expand that outside and there. And there's a few cool ways to kind of adjust these values. If I want to, I can select this object right here and just control that bottom padding. So I'm adjusting that bottom padding. I can adjust the top padding. I could adjust the left padding, and I could adjust that right padding. And you'll see how those values surface over here in the panel. If you click on independent paddings, then you will get each value as its own field. And there's other ways too that you can adjust this. I can command click or control click on Windows over here to basically edit all of those values at once. So I can have them grow in and out. So there's actually a lot of ways that you can interact with this panel that work for you. So let's say if I wanted all of my paddings to be the same, I could just type in 80, and now you can see 80 on the top, right, bottom, left. So someone's asking, they don't understand how padding works. I'll demonstrate that for you. I'll actually go back just a little bit. The way that padding works is, let's say if you're making this like little button or this icon, and you need to give that more breathing room, more space, I can add in like a padding value of 80, right? Or I can bring that down. So let's say I can add in a padding value of 20. So the padding is that outset. It's the space that's around that frame. And if you're familiar with web development, and if you're familiar with the box model, what that padding is doing is just adding that space around that object. So if you're working with, let's take a look at one of these cards that I have here. I'm going to move this over to the padding section. If I want to adjust that padding, I can command click right here and put in like a value of 80. And in this case, it pushes the content in, but it gives me more padding value around that card. Cool. So once again, if you want to adjust on the canvas, you can hold down the Alt key and it'll control both the top and bottom padding, and it'll control the left and right padding. Or if you hold Alt and Shift, it'll control them all together. So there's a number of different ways that you can adjust those padding values. Okay, so right now I just have a very simple, we're going to from scratch, make a bulleted list. I feel that this was possibly the first thing that I made with auto layout, and it's really going to help you understand some of these concepts in a way that will really work for you. So we're going to make a simple custom bulleted list using some of the concepts that we've already discussed thus far. So I'm going to begin by pressing the O key. I'm going to draw out a simple shape. So let's make this shape be about a value of 48 by 48. I'll show you that one more time. If you don't know the shortcut key or the O key isn't working for you, all of the shapes can actually be found up here. So let's say if you wanted to create a fun polygon shape to serve as your bullet, I can easily do that. Let's say I want a pentagon to be my bullet. Let's go ahead and do that. We're all about having fun here. So let's make a fun little pentagon, and that's going to be my bullet for today. Now, what I'm going to do is add some text to go along with this to be in the bulleted list. So I'm just going to call this bullet list item 1. Okay. And what I'm going to do, let's make this just a little bit smaller and move that there. I'm going to select both of these objects. right? So I'm going to select both of these objects and press Shift A. Right. And the one thing that I want you to recognize too, I put this here as a reminder for myself. When you're working with text in Figma or when you're working with text layout in general, you have to be very intentional about how that text is being, how that text box behaves. So right now, when I select this text box right here, and I look over here to the right, there's actually 3 different modes that this text box can be. So auto width will have this text box just go in perpetuity in a constant wide space. So it won't carry over and fit a predefined width. Right. So that's one way you can have your bullet list item. But what I want to do is I want to select this bullet list item and I want this text to grow out vertically once it hits that predefined width. So what I'm going to do here, I'm going to select this and I am going to choose auto height. So now when I set auto height, whenever I fill in my text here, let's say this, this is my bullet list item, you'll see that as I type in text, it's fitting to that exact width. And that's okay. That's what I want. That's how I want it to behave. So we have our auto layout object. We have our single bullet list item, right? It's looking good to go. And now what I'm going to do is I want to make this reusable. So I'm going to create this as a component. So up here, you'll see with this auto layout frame selected, these 4 diamonds. And what that's going to do is make it into a component. If you're wondering what a component is, it's basically an element that you want to reuse again and again. So I've already introduced you to these cards that I've been using. Those are component instances. They are the duplicates instances of those components. So basically, if I make any changes here, I say bullet list item, all of these will update. Oh, I see a lot of talk about undo. Command Z or Control Z is going to be your undo. So if you need to undo something, just hit Command Z or Control Z if you're on Windows. There we go. Okay, cool. So here we now have these 3 bullet list items. And what I'm going to do is select them all. I'm going to select them all, and then I'm going to press Shift A. And what that just did was it wrapped another auto layout object around that. So once again, I can adjust my padding in between. I'm sorry, my spacing in between, and I can adjust those out, and I can now replace that content. So this is, item 1, this is item 2, and this is item 3. And if I want to, I can move that up and down, and I can change other values around this. I already see some people talking about duplicating. If you want to duplicate and you're using auto layout, the best way to do so is with Command D or Control D on Windows. So if I hit Command D, it'll start adding items to my list. And you will see that the list will continue to grow and populate with those items. So I can select that first item and I can hit Command D and it will populate and expand with those items. So once again, this is my bullet list item. I can go in here and I can make like some adjustments on this. And because these are all instances of that component, they're all going to follow suit, except for where we've overridden them. And that's going to be with the text. So how do we combine both horizontally organized objects in auto layout? We already are. So this list item has 2 horizontally, it's basically horizontally arranged objects, right? So that are now vertically arranged. So you're going to have one set that is horizontal, right? And then you're going to have another set. It's just a row. It's just a column. So you're going to have a row of items as one auto layout, and then you're going to have a column of those rows. So once again, we covered the of the auto layout content. I'll show you that once more. I'm going to copy these shortcuts and I will bring it over here. So to break your auto layout content, let's say you want to break out of this, right? You can remove auto layout, right? So Alt Shift A, right? And then that will take it down to a frame, right? And then if you want to break out of that one more time, you can hit Command Shift G, and then that will break it out of that frame. You could also just hit Command Shift G to go straight back into just those objects. That will undo it. And once again, if you're on Windows, it's going to be Control Shift G. So I'll show you that one more time. All of these objects are individual auto layout rows. I can select them, press Shift A, right? They're now all spaced together. If I want to break out of that, I can hit Command Shift G, Control Shift G if you're on Windows, and they're now all individual objects. Cool. So hopefully this is helpful. We're going to move on to our next concept, which is resizing. So right now we showed you how to make an auto layout object. Shift A is that shortcut. An auto layout frame is just that. It's a frame, and it's going to take objects and either arrange them as a column or a row. So you're going to have a column of objects, or you're going to have a row of objects. You can have a row of columns, or you can have a column of rows as your layouts become a little bit more complex. But now we're going to start talking about resizing. So we're going to be thinking about how objects are going to resize with auto layout. And one of the main purposes of that is so you can now start thinking about responsive content. And that's going to be content that grows, depending on its environment, or its environment begins to change itself. So right now, this is a series of auto layout objects. I'm going to just copy this from up above so you can see this like left and right. Basically what's taking place here is that you have here an object, you have here an auto layout row, and then you have a text field, right? And so all of these work inside of this auto layout frame to expand or not. You'll notice that I started to fill this out, and you'll see that it's not following. And that has to do with setting the resize behaviors. There are 3 types of resize behaviors, and we're going to cover all of them in great detail. So you will just, boom, you're like, I got this. There's hug contents. So that's when you are looking and resizing to the contents that you have. If you think about the button growing with the text, that frame is set to hug contents. And it's like getting a little bit of a hug. Fixed is a fixed size. So that's a size that you determine. You set the width and the height to be explicitly that size. When something is set to fixed, right? It's the defining frame. It's the defining values that you're using. And then fill container. Fill container will grow to expand that space. So right here, this is using a combination of them all, and we're going to cover those in just a moment here. But the one thing that I'll show you to fix this, right? You see, this is a fixed height, and because this is a fixed height, it's not growing or scaling the text. So I can change this over here from fixed height to hug contents. And what that's doing is it's looking inside and saying, oh, hey, there's this much content. I should be this tall. So we have these objects expanding that size. Okay. So these are the use cases, right? Right here, we have container responds to the content size. So the container is the auto layout frame. So the frame that is creating this card, its height is currently set to hug contents. Its width is currently set to a fixed width. So that means that this card, I am adjusting the width, and the contents inside expand to fill it. However, the height is different. The more that goes inside of here, right? I just added a whole nother paragraph and it's going to grow to fill, right? I can click on this image and I can make that larger. And that means that this container, at least its height, is expanding to fill the three objects that are inside of it. So there's just an image or like a placeholder image. It's just a rectangle. There's this text that is set with auto height. So that means if I type in more text, this is more text here. As that text grows, it impacts the other objects. So this is just 1, 2, 3. So this is the same thing as just 1, 2, 3. I select them, I press Shift A. Let's add in a fill background color so you can see that. And let's add some padding, because I know some of you are wondering, why do we have padding? And it's so you can see the outset of all those objects, give them some breathing room. And here, right, as I expand this rectangle, it's making the whole thing grow. Usually when I'm making auto layout objects, I like to make little wireframes so I understand how I want something to behave. Typically, this is going to be the case that you're going to be building for. You'll note too that this auto layout frame is set to hug both horizontally and vertically. And because it's horizontally hugging, what I can do is click on that one in the inside and just make that grow. Okay. So right now, this is a container that's going to grow to fit the objects that are inside. I'm also going to take a quick moment to note over here the sensor, the alignment panel. The alignment panel shows you how objects are going to be aligned within there. So they're either left aligned or they're right aligned. And we'll show you how that's going to come into play as you move on. But once again, just having these little wireframed examples of how you want your content to grow, to respond, helps you understand how you're going to construct it fairly easily. So once again, this content is going to grow. This frame is going to grow with this content. Now, there's going to be instances where you want the inside content to respond to the container size. So here, as I grow this container, right, you'll see that the text is either hiding, and we have little ellipses here to show that there's more text. And you'll see that is filling the space. And basically what's taking place here, let's draw out those three rectangles again and create our own little auto layout activity over here. I'm going to select those, press Shift A. Let's give it a fill background of blue so we can see it. And let's add in some padding so we can see that. So here we go, 1, 2, 3 objects. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to select those objects. And right now you see that they are set to fixed height and width. If instead I want them to fill the container up. So hug contents looks at the insides and it's the nested items within, and it snaps to it. Here, we're the contents and we're looking at the parent frame. We are the nested objects and we're looking above and we want to fill that space. So I'm going to set that to fill and that to fill. And what that's going to do is as I resize this container, those objects inside, they're going to grow to fill that space. So each one of these is now growing to fill that space. So here, when I select this, you'll see that they're expanding both horizontally and vertically. And this right here, you'll notice that this text is actually going to an ellipsis. So this text field is using a very special behavior. And what that special behavior is basically truncating the text if there's not enough space for it. So when you select that text field, what you're going to do is hold down the Alt key or the Option key, and it will change that text to truncate text. And that's, I'll have that again in a later slide. So just to review Hug contents, it looks at the items inside of the auto layout frame and it's trying to snap down to them. It'll grow and shrink down with the items that are inside. Fixed sizes are sizes that you set specifically. So you determine, like, I want this width, and then items that are on the inside can then fill to fit that size. So fixed size, you're setting that value. So if I was to set this object, you see those numbers underneath, that says that those are fixed. If I put this into an auto layout frame, you'll see that this frame is set to hug in both directions. Once I resize that, you will then see a fixed value. So when you select an object, the object is going to tell you what is it relying on. A fixed size will show its actual numbers, but a hugged or a fill will see hug or fill. So like, let's say I now set this to fill container, you'll see that its horizontal dimension is set to fill, while its vertical dimension is set to fixed. Okay. And likewise, fill container, when you have an auto layout frame, when you set an object to fill container, it will try to grow to fill that space. Okay, so here we go. If I was to draw these three items, I put them inside of an auto layout frame. I select 1, 2, 3. I press Shift A. Let's give ourselves some padding there. Let's take a look at what that padding looks like. The second that I go from hug, right? So it's hug, hug. The second that I expand that size, that horizontal value is now fixed. And now these three items inside can now be set to fill container. So they will now grow to fill that fixed space. Okay. All right, cool. And someone mentioned something about text. So yeah, if I have text, as long as that text is set, I can option click to truncate it. So if that text is filling the container, when I bring that down in size, that text field, if it's set to truncate text, if it's not set, you'll see the text flow out. But if you hold on the option key and click it, it will then truncate. So likewise, here I have items that are nested inside of an auto layout frame. So as I'm expanding this size, each of these are set to fill in both directions. If I change the vertical resizing instead to hug contents, it will hug all of the pieces that are inside. If I set that to fill, it will grow to fill, as well as its own internal pieces that are inside of there. So just a couple quick resizing shortcuts. This is an auto layout frame and it has these objects inside. Let's say I want this frame to hug its contents. I can double click the edge. Well, double click horizontal. There we go. I double click the edge and I double click the edge. I'll show you that one more time. So here, if I want one of the dimensions to hug the content that's inside here, I just double click and I double click. And once again, let me expand that out. So this frame is set to fixed contents. So it's fixed and fixed, but now I want it to hug. So I just double click and I double click and it's now hugging the contents. Here we have these three objects. And let's say I want them to fill this space. So here's our auto layout frame. Our auto layout frame is set to a fixed width value and it's hugging vertically. So what I can do is I can come in here and I can option or alt key double click and it will now fill that space. I'm also going to take this opportunity to show you one more behavior that we're going to come across in the next section. So now when I select these items, you'll notice the alignment panel. If I adjust the alignment panel, I can determine how those elements inside of those buttons are arranged, right? So if I choose the bottom center alignment, the arrows and everything that's not where we want them to be. If I choose center alignment, okay, that's good and close. But let's say I want them to expand to either side. So with this alignment button selected, I'm going to press the X key, and the X key is changing what is known as the spacing mode, right? So spacing mode, we're spaced between. So what that's doing, when I press that X key with this window, it's spacing everything out. So that makes this much easier to be responsive. So we have these three items in this list, and we have this spacing that exists between them. And what that value is an auto value. So that means it's basically pushing them out as much as they can be. So now when I hit Command D, oops, if I select this and hit Command D, I can add another element. If I screw something up and I scale this down and I want this to fill once again, Option, double click, it'll fill. And if I need to adjust that at all, I press the X key and that will grow and move. All right, next, let's talk about the alignment spacing. We were just talking about the alignment panel. Let's get into it. So these are the items in an auto layout frame, right? And you see how they're basically moving about. And once again, our favorite X key, which shoots them in either direction, basically auto filling the space in between, right? Even when I click there in the spacing, you'll see that that value is set to auto. So I'm going to press the X key one more time. I can change this to being a horizontal direction, right? And we can see how these items are existing within that auto layout frame. I could press the X key to expand them out, but we also have some fun shortcut keys that you can adjust. So if you click the alignment tool and use your arrow keys, right? So up and down and X, you can adjust those elements. I could press the right key, the left key, X, right key, and there's also WASD. We'll put them onto those corners. So up, down, left, right. There's also some hidden gems there if you want to have text baseline alignment. So this is, yes, someone was mentioning Flexbox. Figma is very much in alignment with Flexbox, still adding new properties all the time. But one thing that we do have is text baseline alignment. And what this means is that if you have a bunch of objects here and you want them to align to the baseline of the text, it's this line that's right here. You can go in here and you can press the letter B. And what that's going to do is it's going to align the text items. So you'll notice that the alignment widget kind of changes, and this centers the baseline alignment. And then what I can do here is I can remove that. And if this is a little bit wider, when you press the B key, you can choose it to be left aligned or right aligned, right? And then I can remove that text alignment. So right now, everything is vertically centered, but let's say if I want them to have the same baseline, I just drew in a little baseline there. I can select that and press B, and you'll see that now everything is along that baseline. The reason you might want to have that is you have a bunch of titles that you want to all be in alignment together. So if you have cards that have like a header title, they might be of different sizes. That's going to get that aligned together. The red line, the way that I pulled that up, I press Shift R. So Shift R is going to bring up the rulers, and then I can draw that in. And then it's going to be there. Cool thing about the rulers, they can either be global to your document or they could be local to a frame. And as you adjust them, you'll see the values over here will change to help you get a sense of where that value is. So when I'm hovering over this sensor line here, you'll see it's 168. When I go out, it's a much higher value because it's a much larger canvas. And I can just select it and press delete and have that go. So once again, press Shift R and you draw in a rule. Helps me draw little rule alignments. And then press Shift R again, it hides away. Shift R comes back, Shift R hides away. So canvas stacking, Canvas stacking as well. What's great is let's say you have a whole bunch of objects. Let me throw a big stroke on this one. Let's make this a circle. And let's have a few of them. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's make this red so we can see that. What I can do is when I make them into an auto layout, I'm going to select these objects, press Shift A. They're in an auto layout. Let's say they're overlapping one another. So let's say you're creating a bunch of avatars that are showing everybody's faces one after the other. So here we go. I'll make myself an avatar, and I'm going to grab Alex's avatar. And I'm just pasting these images into those shapes. There we go. So I got me, Alex, and Lauren. Let's say we want to be at the front of this list. If you come over here to the advanced auto layout, there is this canvas stacking option where you can set the first on top, and it'll rearrange how those are going to be stacked. So I pasted the images with Command V. So they were in my clipboard. So if I was to, let's say you want to paste this image onto something else, you can come over here. You could select the fill of that image, Command C, Control C if you're on Windows, select another object and then paste with Command V or Control V on Windows. So images are nothing more than fills on objects. So if I was to create a circle here and hit paste, right, then my photo is just a fill on this shape, and we'll grow with it. So how do you make those little boxes? Up here are all of the different shapes. So if you want to draw a rectangle, if you want to draw a polygon, if you want to draw a star, all of those objects are there. And once again, if you want to place images in here, I can hit Command P. That's the quick menu. Type in the word place, go to place image, and I can pull a bunch of images from here, and I could just click where I want those images to go. So once again, images. Oh yeah, the dark border. So one other fun shortcut to show you all today, I can select this frame, and when I press return, it will select all of the nested auto layout objects. So once again, I select this frame and then I press return. It selects all of those individual auto layout objects inside, and now I can reduce that abysmal stroke that I just created. So I can select the auto layout frame. I can expand those out. And here on the canvas, you want to make sure that you name things appropriately. So this way you don't get these wild frame numbers. So let's just say like avatar row. There you go. So return the backspace in keyboard. No, just return or enter. It's the enter key. Okay, thank you, Alex. So Alex just let me know via cursor chat. You can hit the / key or right click and say cursor chat that I got 15 minutes left. All right. So canvas stacking. Woo, 15 minutes. Canvas stacking right here. Once again, just there. Once again, you pull up the advanced panel and you could put the first on top. Text truncation, we already covered this. So basically here, this is the shortcut key that you need to know. Click on the text field that you want to truncate. Come over here to the fixed size and hold down either the Option key or the Alt key, and then that will truncate the text. So then this way, as this card resizes, the text will get a little bit hidden with the ellipses. Now, another place, if you forget that, you can always click in here into the you can always click into the auto layout. Let me see, text. I always forget where it is now. Here we go. Yeah, resize it here. Truncate text will always be the fourth option under the type panel. So here we go. It's either there or the fourth option in the type panel. Let's pull that up. Resizing, boom, 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 boom. Truncate text. All right, so Last thing I'm going to cover here is just absolute positioning. I'm going to have some questions that y'all have been asking, and I will answer those. Absolute position, though, is absolutely essential when working with auto layout, and I'm going to show you why. Let's say I have a bunch of objects in my layout, right? So I have losing my voice there a little bit. So let's say I have one object, two object, three object, right? And I press Shift A, I make it into an auto layout. Now, let's say I have like a notification icon or something that's going to stick outside of the auto layout, but I still want it to be part of that auto layout. So I go to drop this in and it's not where I want it to be. I'm like, wait, no, I want it to be in the corner. I want it right there. And I go to move it and I can't. Now you can use absolute positioning, which is taken directly from front end development code. It's taken from CSS. We can select that object. And if you come up here, you will see this absolute position option, right? It's going to be these little frames, that little plus size right there. I'm going to take a screen capture of it. There it is. That's absolute position. So when I turn that on, you will see that it's no longer part of the flow. I can move it where I want to go. It's still part of this whole frame, but I choose where I want it to reside. So even as I move things around, it always keeps its location. So this auto position item is really important. Now, let's say if I want it to exist at the bottom. So I can select that object. Let's see. And I'm going to move it. Let's make sure that's absolute positioned. And I want it to be at the bottom of everything, right? So now if I'm adding new stuff, you'll notice it doesn't move with everything else. So if I select it, right? And this is where constraints come into play again. I'm going to choose that this object has center and bottom constraints. So I want it to exist in the center and the bottom. And so now when I hit duplicate, right, it's always gonna follow the bottom of my container. So constraints will show up only when an object is inside of a frame. So Sarah just asked, I don't always see constraints. How do you get that option? The constraints will show up when an object enters a frame. So an auto layout is a frame, and this object is inside of that frame. So that constraint is telling that object how to behave inside of that frame. So if I were to press the F key and draw a frame here, and let's say I just bring this object into this frame. When I resize that frame, I want this object to follow the right and the bottom. So when I select it, you see it says, let's say right and bottom. So now when I resize this, it's always following the right and the bottom. If I say instead, let's follow, the left and bottom, say left and bottom. As I resize this, it's always going to follow the left and the bottom. So constraints will only show up the second I take this out of that frame. You're not going to see constraints anymore. Once I put it back inside of the frame, it has them. Okay, cool. And I would say, like, lastly, I'll just cover this one section right here. These objects, as I am adjusting this auto layout frame here. So if I adjust these values, press the X key and reduce the spacing, right? Each of these have their own auto layout frame and their own absolute position to the top right. So if you want to have, you'll notice in here, the icon, the other thing that I wanted to highlight is that you'll notice that an object in your layers panel is absolutely positioned because it has these little frames around it. So here is the auto layout, right? Here is an icon, and then this is my absolutely positioned element that I can choose where I want it to live and move. And even as I scale that, right, it's going to move and rotate to that top right side. And that's because its constraints are set to right and top. Okay, cool. So That's all that we have for today, but I'm going to answer some questions that we have here. How do we set a nudge value? This is a fantastic question. You set your nudge value if you hit Command P or Control P on Windows to bring up the quick menu. We talked about the quick menu in the introduction. I can type in nudge amount, and the nudge amount right here, your small nudge, I have set to 0.5, but it can be a value of 1. So when you move an object with your arrow key up, down, left, right, it'll only go by 1. If you want to move it in a larger value, that's your big nudge, and that's when you hold down the shift key. So if I set my big nudge to be 20 and I draw a rectangle, my small nudge will move it by 1, but then if I hold on the shift key, it'll now move by 20. And if I want to change my nudge value, Command P, Control P on Windows, and I click on nudge amount, so type in nudge, and I can reset that value back to 8. So that was a fantastic question. So you can't make an auto layout with anything but a rectangle. You can make auto layouts out of frames. So right now, if I draw a frame and I draw like a circle, and I draw a circle inside of it, and I press Shift A, it's making an auto layout from the frame. The thing is that sometimes people will draw a rectangle and they want to make an auto layout of that rectangle. And what Figma does is like, oh, I think I know what you're trying to do. So I'm going to make it into a frame for you. So I'm going to make it into an auto layout frame. So yes, you don't even need a frame to make auto layout. It will automatically convert it for you. So if I just had a bunch of circles, so if I have 1 circle, 2 circle, 3 circle, 4 circle, and I want to make them auto layout, I press Shift A, and now they're all in that auto layout. But basically what's taking place here is that you're making that frame. Now, if you want to, like, let's say if I add in some padding values and I give it a background color, I can round those corners out. So you see here, I'm adjusting the round corners. So now as I add more of these, their radius matches those circles, right? So that's how you can get this kind of like cool pill looking thing. And if I delete something out, you see it moves it there from the right. So great question. So when I copy a card set, constraints disappear. Constraints will disappear if they're no longer inside of a frame. So in order to see the constraints, place the object into either a regular frame with the F key or into an auto layout frame with Shift A. So how can I make responsive design product cards with auto layout? That's a much more targeted question. I mean, there's a lot more here, but basically, if you go in here and let's go to our main component, right? Here's my product card. Me bring this down here. So I made this component. The way that this is constructed, you'll see that there's an auto layout and it's vertical. There's 1, 2, 3, 4. But then within here, there's other auto layouts. Like this is a row, right? This is 3 items that are put together. This row has another item on this side and there's space between. And then this is the last item. So what you do is you make a grouping of auto layout elements that work together in a way that's meaningful. And the way to really do that is just to wireframe it and put it together. Feel free to deconstruct the examples that I have in this document. How do you organize your layers? The way that I organize my layers, normally I do a bit of work first. And then what I do is I take a look at my layers and I begin to name things and structure them the way that it best fits. I try not to create too many frames, but I try not to I try not to have too many loose items. So items that belong together either exist as a component or an auto layout frame as I begin to put those together. What I would typically do is just try to reconstruct it and think about how you're going to communicate those layers to somebody else that you may be working with. So for the time being, naming is hard, right? Structuring things is hard, but it's all about working with people and how they understand and how they work. So oftentimes the way I might structure things would be the way that a front-end developer might expect them to work. So then that way we can work in the file and communicate together. Where can I find Figma basics? Check out youtube.com/@Figma. So youtube.com/@Figma. There's tons of videos that are there that can get you started. Also check out the playground files at figma.com/@Figma. So the entire auto layout playground file, you can duplicate it there. If there are any updates that come to auto layout, they will be made in the playground file. So if you're looking to get a little bit better with that. Also, I wanted to highlight in this file, there's a bunch of auto layout shortcuts. So if you want to learn auto layout shortcuts, this key right here, if you're Windows based, that's going to be the Alt key. And if you see this key, the Command key, that's going to sub out with Control. So if you're ever questioning what your keyboard shortcuts are, always go Command P and type in keyboard shortcuts, and the keyboard shortcuts will be delivered to you on the system, the operating system that you're on. So if you're opening this up with a Chromebook, you will see Chromebook specific shortcuts here catered specifically for you. Okay, we will be sending out a copy of this video within the next week or so. So check your inbox, make sure that it doesn't get delivered to spam. So once this becomes available, we will send this out for your email as long as you've been registered for the event. So what is the 4-diamond thing to bind all of them? That is a component. So a component is that 4-diamond icon. A component is something that you use to make a reusable element. Once you make a component, they then show up here in the assets panel. Then you can just kind of reuse them at will, and you can override those properties. So if I have these 3 components, if I wanted to change them up, I can place images in them all. Let's see, place an image, place an image, place an image, and I can begin to override that text. So components are really important for elements that you're going to reuse. So when you start talking about design, designers make these components to help build and design their products faster in teams. So then this way we're not guessing, what is the source of truth. So this is a component, the easiest way to build a very simple component. Let's make a button component right now. I'm going to press the T key. I'm going to type in the word button. Let's make that text a little bit larger. And then that text field, when I press Shift A, is going to put it into an auto layout frame. Let's call this our button components. Right? This auto layout frame, let's give it a fill color. Let's give it that background color. There we go. And now this button component that we have here, we can adjust the padding. We can select it. We can adjust the corner radius. And now we're ready to make this into a component. We select it. We come up here, and now that it's a component, you'll see it in our library. And I can just drag out a bunch of instances. The cool thing about this is if I make any adjustments to this main component with the 4 diamonds, then all of its instances will follow suit. So if I make the text a little bit bigger, those will be bigger. So I could say button 1 and button 2, whatever it could be, click here. Right. And as I make adjustments to the main component, those changes will be reflected in all of those instances. And you'll note that the instances have a little hollow diamond. So we have our 4 filled in diamonds. That's the main one. And then we have the instance. And that is our last question. That's it for today. Thank you all so much for joining. It's been a pleasure to have you. You will receive the recording in about a week or so. Feel free to check out figma.com/education if you are a teacher, student, and you want to get pro teams for free. Also check out the figma.com/@education. We have tons of templates here. So if you're looking for FigJam, you want to make a syllabus, if you want to see some of the template files from our previous workshops, such as prototyping and animation basics, give that a shout out. Thank you all. Thank you, Alex. Thank you, Lauren, for joining in on the call and being amazing and helping out in the chat. Once again, thank you all for spending this time with us around the globe, wherever you are. You're much appreciated. And as always, you can reach out to education@figma.com or find me on these socials. Take care and have a wonderful day. evening, or morning.